Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos, and today I'm joined by one of my favorite fellow functional RDs, Abby Huber. She is a functional dietitian like myself, but also really specializing in gut health. And so we are going to be talking about the topic that I know everyone wants to hear about, which is leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability. We'll kind of talk about what leaky gut is, what it isn't, how it relates to so many different endocrine imbalances, hormone conditions, autoimmunity, all the things. So I'm super excited to have her on the show to chat about this. And if you haven't already, we have an episode that we actually recorded together many moons ago, at the very beginning of it, when I think we were still at that point, um, Your Nutrition BFF. And
Yeah.
so that was before I think I rebranded to Strength and Hormones. But we have a topic, we have a podcast episode about the role of mold in gut
Mhm.
health issues. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well if you want to give that a listen. But Abby, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
And welcome back, I should say, right?
I was thinking about our podcast and I was like, well, like mold kind of relates to what we're talking about today too.
I know. They both are kind of this can of worms that we can really open up and explore, right?
Definitely.
So we talked a little bit about leaky gut really being also called intestinal permeability. Really, I think more specifically, it should be increased intestinal permeability, right? If we're getting into
Yep.
the weeds of it. But tell us a little bit about just kind of like what leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability is.
Yeah. So to your point, like we have a permeability to the gut that is normal. That's how we absorb nutrients from our foods. That's how our gut kind of interacts with the systemic body. So what happens when we get this increased intestinal permeability or this leaky gut dynamic that we kind of hear a little more commonly referred to is that we have an overly permeable gut. So essentially the barrier system that functions as part of our immune system to kind of keep the gut contained in the gut separate from the rest of the body. I like to think about the gut as like if we were a donut, like the whole body is a donut. So like the frosted part of the donut is the systemic body, and then the hole in the donut is the gut. So that separation is key so that, we're not an eclair. We are in fact a donut. But when we have increased intestinal permeability, we have an over communication between the chaos in the gut to the systemic body. And this is really just going to drive a lot of stress and inflammation. And it's leading to the breakdown of some of the more protective cellular barriers in our gut. And there's a couple different forms of intestinal permeability that I'm sure kind of we'll get into. And there's a lot of root causes that drive intestinal permeability. And it's very present in a lot of different conditions, um, which we'll kind of dive into today.
Yeah, and I mean, we're gonna focus more so in on like hormones, maybe a little bit autoimmunity we'll chat about, but it really spans far and wide. And I'm sure, like with all the digestive conditions you're working with, you see it very often. And I think that one of the most common things that you hear people hear online is about this issue of like food sensitivities. And maybe you can clarify for us why food sensitivities, maybe more so, are driven by this leaky gut type situation.
Yeah. So our gut is part of, again, that immune system. And we actually have a kind of a very sensitive immune system in the gut. And it really functions as this protective barrier system. That's what the gut barrier is really doing to kind of like protect the over responsiveness of the immune system to the systemic body. So when we're experiencing an increased intestinal permeability, we're having a kind of over communication between the immune system and what's happening in the gut, because the gut is a very chaotic organ. That's just the way it's set up. We've got microbes in there, we've got digestion of food and maybe some maldigestion of food, we've got toxins certainly from kind of both our trash can of the gut as our detoxification, as well as the foods that we're taking in from the environment and different compounds and chemicals that can come in with those. So that's just the nature of the gut. And what we can see if there's a breakdown in the barrier system is we're going to have more of an over communication of the immune system, which then is going to lead to this dysregulation. And we're going to see a higher degree of food sensitivities that are not true food sensitivities. So it's a great example because we get a lot of clients that will come and they'll say, like, well, I had a food sensitivity test and it lit up like a Christmas tree. Just like I'm allergic to everything, especially the foods that I'm eating more frequently. And when I see that, I'm like, you're not allergic to all of these foods or sensitive to all of these foods. You have a breakdown in your gut barrier. You have leaky gut. And that is where your immune system is over responding to the proteins in these foods because they're there commonly. So, really, it's about healing the gut barrier, not taking out all of these foods and putting them in the I can't eat because they're bad for me.
Mhm. Of course. And what are some of those classical, maybe top five or so things that you see causing the situation of leaky gut? And why is it so prevalent for so many people?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we have to talk about food quality. So more of like processed foods that are kind of laden with a lot of like chemicals, high fructose corn syrup, dyes, um, toxicants of all sorts definitely are going to drive more of this dysregulation in that gut barrier, kind of causing inflammation in the gut, which then can break down both the mucosal barrier, which is kind of the comfy, cozy barrier system where our beneficial bacteria live, where that gut immune system lives, and the cellular barrier, which is the true kind of leaky gut piece. But we usually have degradation of both of those in this leaky gut. Um, on the other side of that processed food conversation is the lack of nutrient dense food. So, if we're eating higher processed foods or standard American diet, we're not eating a lot of that antioxidant rich, polyphenol rich, fiber rich foods that are going to feed this beautiful protective microbiome that actually is kind of the managers of that gut barrier. So, we're not going to have that kind of like rich ecosystem. We can then see alcohol kind of break down. We can see even some medications break down gut barrier. We can see dysregulation in blood sugar break down gut barrier. We can see stress as a major driver of dysregulation or breaking down of that gut barrier, especially elevated cortisol. Um, we can see, I mean, pesticides and glyphosate definitely can break down that gut barrier. Those would be kind of the big guys, unless you're thinking anything that I missed in that list.
No, I mean, gluten, I know definitely can be like a
There we
trigger.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so food sensitivities like gluten, definitely. Some people like casein could do some, that would be like dairy, could break down that gut barrier. Gluten's probably the more, like, prominent one that we will definitely see. That should definitely have made the short list.
Well, and I think it's kind of confusing for some people with gluten because it's like, okay, gluten can both cause like this leaky gut situation or contribute, but then also if you have a leaky gut, we're going to see more sensitivities arise with gluten. So it's almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg here, right?
Definitely. And that's really where, like, in this idea of like, we are constantly looking for that root cause, and root causes have root causes. So that's like that idea of like, okay, like gluten is driving this intestinal permeability when we see this elevated, antibody response to gluten. But then we're kind of thinking like, okay, are there actually like mold toxins that are driving the food sensitivities to gluten? So actually, our root cause just got trumped and now it's mold. Like, one example that we see often. So it definitely is like that detective hat in why like testing and information from clients is so incredibly helpful because we can keep asking the question of like why? Why? Like that like annoying little kid question why?
Yeah, I think that's my husband always gets mad at me because he's like, "You don't need to know why about everything, and not
I'm
everything
like,
has
"We
an answer." And I'm
do."
like, "It does in my field, okay?" He's like,
And
"Some
we can
things just
usually find
are."
it.
Yeah. That's the difference between a therapist and a dietitian, right?
Like, totally. Yeah, we're gonna keep, like, netting on that why, and, like and I think there's, like to our point we were chatting before of, like, if someone gives you a leaky gut diagnosis, it's really not a diagnosis. Like, yes, it's definitely present and it's definitely a part of this whole kind of, like, symptom storm, or autoimmune storm or thyroid storm or whatever it is that's happening, but it's not enough to just say, like, "Oh, you have leaky gut." Like, that's it, because it's like, why is the leaky gut there in the first place? Like, we have to identify, like, where the tack is and then actually pull the tack out, or else we're just gonna be, like, trying to continuously heal and seal the gut when we haven't really identified what's the major driver in the first place.
Exactly. And maybe you can tell us if we're just thinking about a comprehensive stool analysis, like I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with something like the GI map and maybe have had one done at one point. There are like add-on markers like zonulin, for example. Maybe you can clarify what zonulin is, but I think oftentimes most people don't even run that. I know most of the time I don't even add that on because
Yeah.
there's a lot of other variables we can
Mhm.
see within the GI map that can explain that there is this leaky gut situation going on. So could you just walk us through like what are some of those things that we would see within a typical GI map testing result that might indicate to someone, yeah, you might have leaky gut, that might be part of your root cause situation?
Yeah. I'd say the first marker probably is the beneficials. So, looking at those, like the normal flora, the keystone species that we know to be so protective, if they are depleted, especially in some of those more ones that are integral in the maintenance of the barrier system, like our Akkermansia, they help to maintain the mucosal barrier in the gut, which is again that comfy, cozy barrier that kind of sits on top of that cellular barrier. And we can even sometimes see it actually overgrown. And part of its work is like kind of breaking down and building the gut barrier at the same time. So we can see it both depleted or overgrown. And we're kind of seeing like, okay, either no one's building the barrier or it's actually breaking down the barrier faster than it's rebuilding it. So we can kind of give us some insight that there's some mucosal barrier and intestinal permeability barrier work that we're going to want to do. Or overall depletion of those beneficials is a pretty good giveaway that we likely have some breakdown in that barrier system because that's also kind of the house for our beneficials. I like to think about it as, and we want it to be this like really rich rainforest. And when we have intestinal permeability, it's kind of like, oh, it's the Sahara Desert. And we don't have all those little like trees and bushes and things for all like the animals or the bacteria in this case to like hang out in and live this home in their kind of like comfy, cozy home. Definitely see a lot of like gut overgrowths or kind of pathogenic activity. So we could be seeing things like H. pylori. We could see things like Pseudomonas. We could see other types of overgrowths of pathogenic bacteria that are creating this inflammatory response that are likely to kind of break down gut barrier. Candida is a single handed driver of intestinal permeability. So that one's not very it's kind of hard to get that one to come up on GI map. So when it's there, even if it's in like a normal level, because you can have like high levels or like normal levels or not there. I'd say anytime I see it and it's like at a normal level, I'm like, it's definitely in there way higher than it's like coming up on this test because it's pretty good at like kind of hiding in its little biofilms and things, or it's happening maybe higher up in the GI system, even in the sinuses or somewhere else. If we're seeing low secretory IgA, which is that gut immune system. So this is like if our gut was a club, this is the bouncer to our club. So the role that this secretory IgA, this gut immune system is playing is really keeping pathogens at bay and helping to kind of maintain the integrity of that intestinal permeability. So we can often see it either very high, indicating some sort of kind of infection or food sensitivities or things that are kind of driving a very high immune response and inflammation response that can break down our gut barrier. Or conversely, we could see it very low. And that's that depleted immune system. Your bouncer didn't even show up to work today. And so we have more of a likelihood of like gut pathogens being in there and really no maintenance to that gut barrier. I would say also if we're seeing just overt high inflammation, like a calprotectin marker, in the gut, that's kind of like the big degree of inflammation. We're likely going to see some degree of intestinal permeability. Um, and then if we see kind of dysregulation in like bile production or digestive enzymes, so then we're having maldigestion and that can drive inflammation and food sensitivities and things like that. So that can definitely play a role. So I've just about named the entire test here. But as we can see, there's a lot of like, whenever there's something just that's not like working in this little, well-oiled machine of our gut, it is more likely to have an effect on that leaky gut, that intestinal permeability, which is often why we kind of said, like, if someone gives you that as a diagnosis, it's like, well, what's actually leading to it? Because where's the tack and what are we going to pull out? And lastly, that marker of zonulin, yeah, we don't really add that on from the stool test because that's where um, zonulin is the driver of what kind of opens up the space between our cells in order to kind of absorb nutrients. So we have a higher zonulin production after meals. That's just the way that we absorb nutrients. Now, what we can see is that zonulin stays elevated if there's a gluten sensitivity or if there's high degrees of intestinal permeability. But based on, just getting that stool marker, maybe we were testing and they had just had breakfast and it was a normal elevation of zonulin. So I don't it's hard to read into a stool marker of zonulin, but we can measure zonulin or anti-zonulin through blood testing with with a test like the Vibrant Wellness Wheat Zoomer test, and can get a better degree of um, the intestinal permeability, especially if there's more of this like paracellular or transcellular. Like, are just the cells intact, but they've just been driven apart because of that kind of inflammation or gluten or, any of the things that are kind of leading to that intestinal permeability? Or do we have an actual breakdown of the cells themselves? And that's transcellular, which at the cells are actually kind of like ripping apart. Sounds very intense. And that's really just going to make a bigger impact on like how long and how intensive we kind of need to be in that like restoration of the barrier system of the gut.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that can be really valuable for some individuals that need more of that thorough dive in things. And I even see a lot of times that they are just started on like Akkermansia as a probiotic. And oftentimes that really does nothing for this Akkermansia measure because we're still not addressing the root cause of the leaky gut. Right. And so it's really not going to move the needle much. You often see that in practice?
Oh, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't really seen that like colonizing or like making more Akkermansia. But I do think there's some like you get like the postbiotic benefits to it. But yeah, it's kind of like let's deal with like identify the tack and pull it out in order to like really get that's even just like throwing a ton of nutrients to like heal. Like people are like, oh, L-glutamine, like amazing. And it can make a really big difference in someone's symptoms and helping them, not have GI pain or soreness or just like that kind of like raw feeling sometimes that people can have with intestinal permeability. But still, it's are we addressing what's breaking it down in the first place? Or are we just playing this game of I'm over supplementing nutrients faster than the gut is being broken down. And therefore I'm just keeping my ship afloat. But, I'm like playing whack-a-mole with kind of covering the holes that the ship is sinking. And I'm just having it sink slower is kind of
Yeah.
that game we can get into if we really don't do that like testing deep dive.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, so we talked a little bit at the beginning about the relationship that there is a relationship between leaky gut and specific hormone conditions, and so I want to get into a couple of those relationships that there are. So we know that there, from the research, that there is a relationship between leaky gut and PCOS. What are we seeing in a situation? Maybe you can just, if you want to speak specifically to PCOS or just like a situation of high androgens in general, why is there this correlation between leaky gut and PCOS?
Yeah, I mean, really, my perspective, because I'd love to. I mean, you're like such the hormone guru here. Um, really, just the driver of inflammation, I think, is what, that kind of we're really getting with intestinal permeability. We're really triggering this systemic inflammatory response. And then we can see that really triggering kind of this like cortisol stress adrenal um, pressure in the body, and we can kind of actually as a result of that like kind of burn the adrenals out, and then we're getting kind of the fallout of impacting certainly our hormones in terms of that like kind of HPA axis, HPATG axis. We're affecting like everything through this just systemic inflammatory response. And we're very much seeing, especially in that androgens, like inflammation and likely blood sugar dysregulation. Because once we're talking about stress and cortisol and adrenals, we're likely seeing an impact in insulin and blood sugar because those are kind of going hand in hand. And then we're going to see the effects on like elevated androgen production or kind of testosterone elevations, like all of that kind of profile picture that we can see with the different types of PCOS from our kind of inflammatory to the androgens. Um, and really part of that is very much like looking at how is the gut playing this role and doing that kind of inflammation detective um, like search of like where is the inflammation coming from, because we can see those inflammation markers and we can see that inflammation story when we look at the hormones, but it's not the hormones just being like we're going to be inflamed today and we're just going to like be, upset and angry. It's really then finding out like, okay, where is it? And then we're working on the adrenals and we're working on the blood sugar and we're working on the gut. So it really kind of comes down to like the unsexy foundations and some loving up on the gut.
Well, and I think that it's an important aspect of it because a lot of times when people have a hormone imbalance, such as PCOS, maybe they're not experiencing overt GI symptoms. They're like, yeah, I feel a little bit bloated, but it's not that bad. Or no, I'm going to the bathroom regularly. I'm not having diarrhea. I'm not constipated, whatever. But we know that there's this relationship, this intense relationship between the gut triggering this inflammatory response, and then that being one of the big drivers of PCOS, hypothyroidism. I mean, it's the whole reason as to why I created our program, Inflammation Harmony, because inflammation is such a big first driver to all of these hormone imbalances, right? And so we have to look at the gut, even if there isn't symptoms. And maybe that's something you can just talk to a little bit is like, what do you typically see in practice? How many of your clients are actually like extremely symptomatic in these areas versus what you're actually seeing show up and their testing and how that's even playing a bigger role in their healing process?
Yeah. I think it's such an interesting and like a harder sell when it's like we're talking to a client, we're like, "Oh, we really need to test your gut." They're like, "No, my gut's like fine." Like that's like or it's on the scale of what's an annoying symptom to them. The gut is like the lowest and they're like, "No, it's like my acne and it's my weight and it's my, painful periods or it's like whatever it is or that's kind of higher up on the like this is impacting my day-to-day life and like my mild bloat that I experience is like actually the least frustrating. But when we actually look and test the gut, we can often see that there's that depletion of beneficial bacteria. And that's what's showing up as like the acne and inflammation on the skin that's going hand in hand with that kind of PCOS picture that we're getting painted. Or we're seeing, just kind of the co-relationship between this kind of intestinal permeability driving stress and creating this like hypothyroid dynamic, which then is creating more constipation or something, or just like slowed motility. But maybe someone's been told it's normal to just go to the bathroom once every 3 days. So it's also that like re-educating like what is an optimal bowel movement, what is like a non-symptomatic gut, because sometimes when we actually start to get more in the weeds of that conversation, it's like, oh, well, yeah, okay, I go to the bathroom like every other day, or sometimes it's like every 3 days, or you start to kind of tease out and get like more of, okay, so we do have some symptoms, but they're just like, they're not huge, they're not loud. And maybe someone just really didn't know, like, what is a normal bowel movement? What should my gut feel like? Or we can often see like even heartburn, especially when we're dealing with kind of like estrogen fluctuations and low progesterone, especially heartburn or acid reflux that's kind of happening in that ovulatory phase or that luteal phase, because of the like kind of imbalance or elevations in estrogen triggering some histamines in the gut. So
No, I think it's helpful to bring that up because it even like poses the question of like, should you time when you do your GI map so that it's not when you're in a high estrogen phase, or maybe even just take that into consideration when you're looking at your GI map results, right?
yeah, I think everything to do with women, we have to know, like, where were you in your cycle when you did this? Where were you in your cycle when you're I mean, this is where, like, it's always interesting, like, with women, it's kind of like, "Oh, yeah, and when does that symptom come up? Does it come up in correlation to the month?" And if someone's like, "I've never really thought about that before," we should always be thinking about if something feels like a does something feel like a cyclical response that we're getting, like, like, periods of time during the month, or is it very irregular and doesn't have anything to do with our cycle? Because that's gonna help us to kind of understand, a little bit more of our hormones playing a role in kind of, like, pouring gasoline on the fire of this inflammation dynamic that's really rooted in the gut.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a little bit with PCOS that it can show up, as acne. That can be a symptom for individuals. And I want to talk a little bit about for those that maybe don't have PCOS, they don't have this classical high androgen situation. Maybe we've done hormone testing. They actually are dealing with like low estrogen levels or something completely different. What is the relationship between leaky gut and acne? What do you typically see causing the leaky gut, then causing some of this acne situation?
Yeah, I would say, like, kind of coming back to results from a GI map test, which is that comprehensive stool test, like, most often we're seeing depleted beneficials. So we're not seeing the good guys in their robust amounts because those have a very strong anti inflammatory effect in the GI system. And they're very integral to maintaining that intestinal permeability, that gut barrier system. So we're really seeing that kind of inflammation from the gut showing up on the skin. And that lack of beneficial bacteria, either from maybe a lack of kind of polyphenols from plant based foods and fiber in the diet. Maybe we're not feeding those beneficials enough. Maybe there was a history of antibiotic use, or even that kind of vicious cycle of we go to the dermatologist, they give us antibiotics to treat our acne, and all of a sudden we're dug even deeper into the hole because it wasn't a pathogenic bacteria that was leading to our acne. It was actually a depletion of the beneficials. But we can also see pathogenic, kind of opportunistic infections in the gut leading to acne. We can see kind of overgrowths of like SIBO like bacteria or just pathogenic strains of bacteria causing inflammation, showing up on the skin as acne. We often will, kind of see oftentimes we catch people in the depleted stage where their immune system, that bouncer, is very isn't really showing up to the job anymore. Typically, we're kind of like the last stop for people. They're like, well, I went to my PCP and then I went to the dermatologist or I went to the GI or I went to, and they've had quite the journey getting to us. And they're like, and now we're at you. And we might as well call you a witch doctor, but we're so happy to be here. And it's kind of like that journey of at one point, they had a very elevated immune response, but the body can only stay elevated in cortisol or in immune response or in these dynamics for so long until it starts to kind of have to self protect itself and shut things down. And then we can see this kind of depleted picture too. I would say the maldigestion, especially seeing like a elevated marker called steatocrit, which is a maldigestion of dietary fat and kind of an indication of not enough bile production, is also another that we see pretty frequently in our more like acne prone clients, or certainly clients that are having issues clearing estrogen, because that's part of the mechanism that helps to take the trash from the liver, especially estrogen trash, put it in the gut and take it out into the toilet. So those would be probably the more common like patterns that I'll see for our like acne clients, kind of similar for our eczema clients too. I know we're not talking about that, but just like skin in general.
Yeah, of course. I think a lot of skin conditions show up really similarly,
Yeah.
and the gut for sure.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk a little bit thyroid specific. So, with the thyroid, I would say the most common we're going to see is hypothyroidism that's related to Hashimoto's. So, Hashimoto's being autoimmune condition that's where the immune system is attacking those thyroid cells and causing that destruction of those thyroid hormones. It's the most common cause of hypothyroidism in women. So let's kind of differentiate between like the leaky gut situation that we see with hypothyroidism and versus Hashimoto's, because I think that so very often people think about treating the Hashimoto's as if it's just a hormone imbalance. And while it might be a hormone imbalance secondarily, primarily it's an autoimmune condition, right? And not everyone even has the hormone imbalance that comes with Hashimoto's. So maybe you can just differentiate for us like what's going on with this leaky gut picture and the thyroid in both non-autoimmune and autoimmune.
Yeah. I mean, one of the like drivers of autoimmune and kind of that like three-legged stool model is really leaky gut as that kind of driver of this systemic inflammatory response that's kind of leading to this dysregulation of the immune system and this over communication between chaos of the gut, that hole in the donut, and that's kind of systemic like frosted part of the donut. So really what we can see in that kind of non-autoimmune dynamic is really that systemic inflammation, typically kind of seeing it impact um, I imagine that it's kind of first kind of taking a hit on the adrenals, causing that kind of stress response. And then we're seeing that kind of cortisol impact to the brain, which is then kind of lowering communication between the brain and the thyroid. And we're seeing that more like classic hypothyroid, elevated TSH, where the brain's kind of yelling a little bit more like thyroid, like do your job. And then we're kind of seeing the fallout from there. We also can see it too in terms of intestinal permeability impacting the nutrient absorption for those kind of critical nutrients for the thyroid. We can see intestinal permeability also creating, especially if there's some like GI infections and some endotoxins, which are like byproducts created by bacteria that are like very toxic when they get into the systemic body. And we can actually see those kind of creating burden in the liver, and then we're not converting the inactive to active thyroid as much. So those would be kind of a couple of the patterns that we could see. And maybe we're not having this kind of like autoimmune dynamic in those more classical hypothyroid. Um, but once we start really getting the more susceptibility from a genetic standpoint, from the intestinal permeability there, and then some sort of kind of triggering event. Um, that really kind of is like the cup spills over, or the like straw that breaks the camel's back of sorts, we start to then get that kind of immune response. And we certainly could see, this is where like molecular mimicry could come in. And we have gluten as a driver from a food sensitivity with that intestinal permeability, where, if we didn't have intestinal permeability, maybe gluten wouldn't be such a big driver. But when we have both of them together, or one driving the other, um, we can then kind of have this idea that the immune system is kind of labeling gluten as an issue. And then, as like the gluten antibodies can look similar to some of our thyroid structures, and we start to then label the thyroid. Um, you know, mislabeling the thyroid with that term molecular mimicry is kind of what we're talking about here. And then we start to get this kind of autoimmune dynamic, and that autoimmune dynamic will also drive inflammation too. So now we've kind of got this more like vicious cycle that can be happening of this kind of damage to the thyroid, continued damage to that intestinal permeability. And that's where we're really working more methodically to say, where is this inflammation coming from? Where is the immune system getting dysregulated from? And really the first place that we really like to start is in the gut, because that is kind of it's the most open organ system to our outside environment, and it is most likely one of the major drivers of that inflammatory response. And we do know in that three-legged stool model that it is one of the kind of critical pieces that typically and needs to be present in order to kind of tip the scale to that autoimmune presentation.
Yeah. And so I think that, just to kind of like reiterate some of the points that you've made that I think are so important, that I want to make sure listeners like leave here remembering, is that leaky gut is not just leaky gut, right? There's something else that's driving this leaky gut type response that's happening. So we can't stop at just leaky gut being the diagnosis or the imbalance, if you will, right? And even if you don't have overt GI symptoms, if you are having, stress related issues like high cortisol or adrenal insufficiency or Hashimoto's or autoimmunity, the gut has to be an area that's explored, because it's such a triggering aspect of this inflammatory response that then leads to these other imbalances. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's very eloquently put.
Okay, awesome. So, tell us a little bit about like what are some of the things that someone can do to be able to support prevention of leaky gut. Maybe give us a couple of things that they can look at doing and that they can look at not doing.
Yes. I mean, first we have to look at our food quality. So, what are we eating? And are we eating this very like colorful diet? So we're having kind of 5 different colors of fruits and vegetables a day, 30 different varieties of them throughout the week. That's really what's going to be such a foundation of feeding that protective gut microbiome that's really maintaining the integrity of the gut barrier. We want to look at, are we eating regularly throughout the day? So that meal timing. So we're not going for these long periods of fasting, because fasting, can be helpful in certain instances, but really can be, when overused, a driver of this like stress and inflammation. And we want to support our adrenals, and our adrenals love this kind of more routine, hugging that more like circadian eating pattern where we eat first thing in the morning and we're really kind of wrapping up, a nice 2 to 3 hours before bed of sorts. Um, we really want to think about, some of the things that we're like looking at more critically not doing is kind of overusing alcohol. That's a very significant driver of intestinal permeability. And I think they're we have to kind of put that on the radar of like as much as, a wind down with a glass of wine at night, if we're doing it 5 days a week, like we are having just kind of little insults every night. And then are we kind of getting the balance of are we breaking down the gut faster than we can build the gut up? We have to talk about protein foods, getting really rich animal proteins into the gut so that we're getting those really easy to digest proteins because the gut is made of protein, especially our barrier system. Plant proteins are great too, but I really like to see a good like balance between them with a little bit more tipping towards animal proteins just because of the ability to digest and assimilate those is so much more significant from animal proteins than from plant proteins. So nice diversity of both, but really making sure those amino acids are going to be critical for building the barrier system of the gut. Some sort of stress practice, something that we're, um, you know, really regularly doing on a daily basis. And this could be separate from exercise because exercise is not a stress. It can make us feel really good, but it is not a stress reducing practice. If anything, sometimes it's actually the stress creating process. And we want to really make sure that um, we're not over exercising because over exercising can be also a driver of intestinal permeability. So we're having some other way of managing and kind of supporting ourselves, which could be a meditation practice, kind of a breath work or deep breathing, reading, going for a gentle walk, watching the sunset, doing something that makes you feel joy and that you enjoy doing, and maybe kind of coming up with a list of things that you enjoy doing and then doing them on a very daily basis for, ideally 15 minutes a day. Um, those would be my like quick list of the top ones. Anything
Okay.
that
Yeah, and then you mentioned too, like how important that mucosal barrier is to this picture of leaky gut, right? And how important akromansia is for that. Is there anything specifically that you would recommend listeners trying to incorporate on a daily basis to be able to help keep that mucosal barrier and that akromansia in a healthy place?
Yes, I would say kind of the two most critical things for that are our Akkermansia loves red polyphenols. So really emphasizing that kind of whole red family of fruits and vegetables. So we've got our pomegranate seeds, we've got our red cabbage, we've got our red apples, like any sort of kind of red, orange, yellow, even are really key food sources for those critical Akkermansia and those other really critical, just kind of what are called short chain fatty acid producers that are the really anti-inflammatory major compounds that have a huge part in actually rebuilding and keeping the integrity of the intestinal permeability. This can also be like more resistant starches where we're having cooked and cooled potatoes, cooked and cooled rice. Um, I would say also increasing kind of mucilaginous foods. So these could be foods like our kind of like chia seeds and ground flax seeds that kind of when you soak them, they get like kind of like I was gonna say mucus-like, which
Jelly?
is really yeah, there
Jelly?
we go. I was like, that's a really not an appealing way to talk about food. This can also be things like in tea form where we're using slippery elm or marshmallow teas. They even have a lot of like throat coat tea is a great, I think I'm forgetting the brand that throat coat is, but I kind of always love
Mussels?
I think it is. It might be or it's like yogi tea. It's
Or
either
yogurt?
traditional medicinal or yogi tea. That's why I was like going back and forth in my brain. But it's got a couple of those great like mucilaginous blends, and it's ones you can buy at like Whole Foods, or you could go the like loose leaf and kind of do your own like witchy thing about it, which we always
Mhm.
like to encourage clients on. Um, those would be kind of the like two mucilaginous foods, and if, like aloe could be a great one too. I always love to incorporate I love George's aloe. That's kind of my, like, favorite brand because it doesn't have a taste to it, and just having clients add it to like, a little bit of water throughout the day or in a smoothie or something like that, because that's gonna really help with that mucus membrane, especially if you're experiencing, like, heartburn. That can actually be, a really helpful way to kind of, like, heal that mucus membrane, which can be a part of driving that kind of irritation, heartburn, discomfort picture.
Sure. Okay. So, do you think that these strategies you just gave are sufficient if someone has leaky gut to heal the leaky gut? Or do you feel like these are things that are, I suppose, like supportive of some of the other tools?
Yeah, it kind of depends. I feel like leaky gut is like has such a range And this is where we can see, like, I mean, I feel like everyone has that, like, friend that they're like, "Oh my god, my friend just did this one thing," and they, like, reversed all their gut issues and everything, and they're like, "Why was that so easy for them?" And then they do the exact same thing, and they're like, "Okay, like, I feel like 1% better. Like, what
Yeah.
the heck?" And it's like that person's, intestinal permeability or dynamics might just be more kind of driven into their bodies because I think this is where, like, we are more of a perfect storm of our um chronic health challenges than we are like the one insult. And it's like, okay, we had intestinal permeability and then we got in, we injured our back in a workout and then we took a lot of like NSAIDs in order to like help with the pain. And then that further drove more intestinal permeability. And then, we had a dentist appointment, we had to take an antibiotic. And all of a sudden it's like, well, my IBS or my thyroid stuff or my like autoimmune condition like came out of nowhere. And when we kind of look back, we're like, it didn't really come out of nowhere, but it was kind of like simmering under the surface. But that could be very different than someone who just grew up eating low nutrient dense foods and just kind of decided that they were going to improve the quality of their diet because they were having some symptoms and all of a sudden like ipso facto they're like major glow up and they feel amazing. Like two very different pictures of the dynamics that is probably the degrees of intestinal permeability that were present. So that's where we do want to like be more methodical of like what's going on. If there are GI infections, just changing the diet's not really going to help us with that. It's certainly a critical part of what has to be done in that order of operations. But even like beneficial bacteria, sometimes we need to like really load in terms of that more like supplemental prebiotics and like targeted probiotics and like immune support pieces in order to like get that like sticky Akkermansia that sometimes like just won't increase in somebody's gut. Um, and like, so it just, everyone's their own like nut to crack.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that when you see information out there because some people will say like, "Oh, all you need to do is just add in this one food," or like the old adage of like, "Just eat, count calories and exercise more," or whatever it might be, right? And then for other people, it's like they have to do a whole laundry list of things every day just so they can go to the bathroom once, and everyone's sensitivity to these things is so different. And I think it can be really frustrating if you are someone that needs to do the whole laundry list when you see that someone else only needs to do one thing to be able to achieve the same outcome that took you 100 things to be able to get there.
Yeah, I always feel a little like I'm always like be stitious of the people in like the social media world that are like all you need to do. I'm like nope, 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 out of here. Like it just is not a helpful frame for
Yeah.
those people that are like more of like I mean I put myself in that category. I was the canary in the coal
Right.
mine for most of my life like struggling with all these symptoms and it took like a good 10 years to unwind them. I would like to think nowadays with like the knowledge and everything that we've done in the testing like I could shrink that down to 2 to 4 but 2 to 4 is not necessarily short either, so
Yeah.
it's less than 10 though.
Yeah. I know. I was talking with someone on a podcast last week and I was saying like how, for me it was like a journey of like 10 years and I'm like,
Mhm.
surely it would never take 10 years like, working with someone else. I'm like, but for me it
Yeah.
took 10 years because it was like all of this like learning along the way that is what led me to get to where I needed to be to like feel wholly balanced, right? And so so I think that's a really good point that you bring up and everyone's timeline is going to look a little bit different, but surely if you've been at it for a couple of years and you're not getting better, there's something that's missing from your bigger picture of your treatment plan. And that includes if you've been diagnosed with leaky gut or been told you have leaky gut. If it's been going on for several years, then you might want to call Abby to to see what could be going on deeper beneath
Get us
that.
in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because it's confusing, like, it really the truest statement I've ever heard is, like, everything is connected to everything. As
Yeah.
unhelpful as, like, that sometimes can hear, especially if you're in a healing journey, you're like, "That is un" you know, doesn't feel constructive, but it is the way it works in the body. And one of my favorite questions to like in my screening calls for clients is like, if is there anything that you're like, I have absolutely no idea if this is connected to anything that you do, but like this is also something that I like find annoying. And I'm like,
Yeah.
ooh, give me because sometimes it's like that little nugget that it's like, oh, that's what we need to like really go down the rabbit hole of because it's usually some like dermatitis on the back of their
Yeah.
head or something, and I'm like, "Ooh, now we're going fungal." Like,
Yeah.
I'll go there with you.
Yeah, I know, I do love those little nuggets that you find
Ye
out, right?
Yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Abby, for sharing all of your wisdom. I know that this is like a topic that we could go down a million rabbit holes with, but I hope that at least it begins some of the, I guess, clarification around what leaky gut is and what it isn't, and its connection to these different systems and hormone conditions and things in the body. So, tell us a little bit about where listeners can learn more about you and your practice.
Yes. So my practice is called Above Health Nutrition. You can find us at our website, abovehealthnutrition.com, active on social on Instagram, Above Health, now on TikTok, Above Health. That's a newer one. And we also have a podcast, Your Body Has Your Back, talking about the kind of the foundations for gut and hormones.
Love it. Thank you so much, Abby.
Thank you.